I'm Lieutenant Lucinda Sheffield, 28 years old, and I built my career in the Navy through discipline and hard work. For years, I carried my brother, covering his mistakes, smoothing over his failures, always protecting him. But on my own wedding night, when he shoved me to the floor and split my head open in front of everyone, I drew the line. My fiancé, a Navy SEAL officer, made it clear that was an attack on an officer. In that instant, Jason's life changed forever. Have you ever been betrayed or humiliated by the very person you spent years defending? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. And before I dive into what happened, tell me where you're watching from. If you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. What came next might surprise you. 3 weeks before my wedding, Jason made his first real mistake. Not the shove, that came later. This was smaller, quieter, but it should have been my warning. We were at Mom's house, going over seating arrangements. I'd just gotten off a 12-hour shift, still in uniform, trying to be patient while everyone debated whether Aunt Linda should sit near the bar. Jason walked in, took one look at me, and snorted. Still playing dress up, I see. The room went quiet. Mom shot him a look, but I kept my voice level. It's called a job, Jason. Right. A job where you get to boss people around all day. He grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped it open with more force than necessary. Must be nice, having everyone salute you. That's not how it works. Sure it isn't. He took a long drink, eyes never leaving mine. Just remember, some of us knew you before you got all important. My fiancé Emmerich shifted beside me, but I touched his arm, a small gesture that said I'd handle this. I'd been handling Jason my whole life. The comments became a pattern. At the rehearsal dinner venue walkthrough, when the coordinator praised my organizational skills, Jason muttered something about control freaks, just loud enough for everyone to hear. When we discussed the ceremony timeline, he questioned why Emmerich got to wear his dress blues. Seems like showing off to me. Emmerich, to his credit, stayed calm. 8 years as a Navy SEAL had taught him when to engage and when to let things roll off. But I caught him watching Jason more carefully, the way he'd watch a suspicious movement in his peripheral vision. The worst moment came during the bachelor party planning. Jason had insisted on organizing it, despite Emmerich's friends offering to handle everything. When Emmerich mentioned he'd prefer something low-key, maybe dinner, a few drinks, Jason laughed. Come on, man. Don't let her turn you into one of those whipped guys who can't have fun. She's not controlling anything, Emmerich said, his voice carrying that particular stillness that meant he was choosing his words carefully. I just don't need to get blackout drunk to enjoy myself. Right. Because you're so disciplined. Jason drew out the word like it tasted bitter. Must be exhausting, being perfect all the time. I watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway unseen. The way Jason's shoulders tensed when he talked about discipline. The way his jaw set when Emmerich responded with quiet confidence instead of rising to the bait. Something was building in my brother, some resentment that ran deeper than sibling rivalry. That night, after everyone left, I found myself staring at old photos on Mom's mantle. Pictures of Jason and me as kids, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. In one, I was maybe 8, he was 10, and we were covered in mud from building forts in the backyard. He'd been my protector then, the one who made sure I got included in the neighborhood games, who taught me how to throw a punch when Tommy Richardson kept pulling my hair. When had that changed? Emmerich found me there, still in his civvies, looking tired but patient. You okay? He used to have my back, I said, not looking away from the photos. When we were kids, if someone messed with me, Jason would handle it. Now it feels like he's the one looking for reasons to mess with me. Some people don't know how to handle other people's success. I turned to face him. It's more than that. He acts like I've betrayed something by making something of myself. Like I owe him an apology for not staying exactly where I was when we were 12. Emmerich nodded, understanding without me having to explain further. That was one of the things I loved about him. He didn't need everything spelled out. He'd seen this dynamic before in other contexts. The way some people resented discipline because it highlighted their own lack of direction. He's going to keep pushing, Emmerich said quietly. You know that, right? I did know. Jason had always been like that, testing boundaries, seeing how far he could go before consequences kicked in. As kids, I'd been the one to pull him back from the edge, to smooth things over when his mouth got him in trouble. I'd covered for him when he broke Mom's lamp, when he got suspended for fighting, when he wrecked his car and needed someone to call Dad and explain why he couldn't. The pattern was so ingrained I hadn't even questioned it. Jason pushed, I caught. Jason fell. I cushioned the landing. It had worked for 28 years because the stakes were smaller then. Broken lamps could be replaced. Suspensions ended. Even car repairs were just money. But this felt different. The way he looked at my uniform, like it was a costume I wore to mock him. The way he talked about Emmerich, like our relationship was some kind of performance designed to make him look bad. There was an edge to it now that hadn't been there before. The night before the wedding, Jason called me. Late after midnight, his words slightly slurred. "Hey sis. Just wanted to say, you know I'm proud of you, right?" I'd been half asleep, but something in his tone made me sit up. "Jason? Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Just thinking about tomorrow." "Big day." "It is." I waited, sensing there was more. "Remember when we were kids? How we used to talk about our weddings? You said you wanted something small, just family." "I still do. That's why it's just family and close friends." "Right. Close friends." A pause. "Like your military buddies." There it was. The real reason for the call. "They're my friends, Jason. People I work with, people who matter to me." "Sure. I get it. New life, new people." His laugh had no humor in it. "Just feels weird, being the old family at your new family's party." "That's not what this is. Isn't it?" The slurred words were sharper now. "You in your fancy dress, him in his fancy uniform, everyone talking about honor and service and all that. Where does that leave the rest of us?" I closed my eyes, recognizing the trap. If I reassured him, I'd be feeding into self-pity. If I didn't, I'd be confirming his fears. There was no right answer because the question itself was wrong. "It leaves you as my brother," I said finally. "Same as always." "Same as always," he repeated, but something in his voice suggested he didn't believe that anymore. Looking back, it wasn't sudden. The signs were there, I just didn't want to see them. The reception was perfect until it wasn't. Mom had outdone herself with the flowers, the band was hitting all the right notes, and Emmerich looked impossibly handsome in his dress blues. I'd changed into my evening uniform for the formal photographs, the one with the ribbons and insignia that represented 8 years of disciplined service. I was talking with Commander Phillips and his wife, accepting their congratulations, when I saw Jason approaching from across the room. Even from a distance, I could read his body language, shoulders set, jaw tight, that particular stride he'd had since childhood when he was working up to something. "Excuse me," I said to the commander, stepping away from the conversation. Some instinct made me want space, room to maneuver. Jason stopped 3 feet away, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. His eyes were bright, unfocused, but his voice was clear. "Having fun with your fan club?" "Jason." I kept my voice low, aware of the people around us. "Not here." "Why not here? This is supposed to be a family celebration, right?" He gestured broadly at the room, the motion unsteady. "Or is it more of a military recruitment event?" I saw Emmerich moving toward us from the corner of my eye, but I held up a hand, subtle, but enough to keep him back. I'd handled Jason in worse states than this. "You're drunk," I said quietly. "Let's get you some coffee." "I'm not that drunk." His laugh was too loud, drawing attention. "Not too drunk to see what this really is. Look around, Lucinda. Half the people here are in uniform. The other half are pretending to be impressed by your little light show. Lower your voice." "Why? Embarrassed of your family now? Afraid we'll say the wrong thing in front of your important friends?" The conversation around us had started to fade as people became aware of the tension. I could feel eyes turning our way, curious and concerned. This was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid. "I'm not embarrassed of anyone," I said, still keeping my voice calm and low. "I'm asking you to respect the people I care about." "Respect." He repeated the word like it was foreign. "Right. Because you've got so much of that now. Everyone respecting Lieutenant Lucinda, the disciplined one, the successful one." His voice was getting louder despite my attempts to quiet him. Tell me, when did you get so much better than the rest of us? I never said I was better than anyone. You didn't have to say it. You just put on that uniform and let everyone else figure it out. He stepped closer, invading my personal space the way he used to when we fought as teenagers. The golden child, always doing everything right, making the rest of us look like screw-ups just by existing. I could see Emmerich now, positioned where he could intervene if needed, but still giving me space to handle my brother. Commander Phillips and several other officers were watching, their expressions carefully neutral but alert. This was my family, my problem to solve. Jason, you're making a scene. Good. Maybe it's time for a scene. Maybe it's time someone said what everyone's thinking. His eyes were bright with alcohol and something darker. That you've turned into someone who thinks she's too good for where she came from. That's not true. Isn't it? When's the last time you came home without that uniform on? When's the last time you talked to any of us without sounding like you're giving a briefing? The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it. The military had changed me, made me more formal, more careful with my words. But it had also made me stronger, more confident, more capable of handling exactly this kind of situation. I'm the same person I always was. No. His voice dropped to a whisper, but somehow that made it worse. You're not. And the really sick part is you don't even see it. He was close enough now that I could see the red in his eyes, smell the whiskey and anger coming off him in waves. 20 years of covering for him, smoothing over his mistakes, making excuses for his behavior, and this was what I got in return. Step back, Jason. Or what? You'll have me arrested? Court-martialed. He laughed, harsh and bitter. Oh wait, I forgot. I'm not important enough to rate that kind of attention. That's when he shoved me. Not hard enough to knock me down immediately, but hard enough to make me stumble backward. My heel caught on the edge of my dress, and I went down hard, the back of my head connecting with the corner of a decorative table before I hit the floor. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Then the pain hit, sharp and immediate, and I felt something warm trickling down my neck. Blood. Gasps filled the room. Someone screamed, probably Mom. I lay there for a moment, stunned, looking up at the ceiling while the world tilted and swayed around me. Then Emmerich was there, kneeling beside me, his voice calm and professional. Don't move. Let me check your head. I could hear him, but I was watching Jason. My brother stood frozen above us, his face draining of color as he realized what he'd done. The alcohol-bright confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like terror. Emmerich's hands were gentle but sure as he examined the cut on my head. It's not deep, but you're going to need stitches. Then he stood, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight I'd rarely heard outside of official settings. That was an attack on an officer. The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Jason's face went white, then gray. He understood what Emmerich was saying, what it meant beyond the immediate drama of a family fight. In that moment, everything changed. The line between family dispute and criminal act had been crossed, and there was no crossing back. Growing up, Jason and I were inseparable. Not because we were similar, even as kids, we were opposites, but because we balanced each other. He was impulsive where I was careful, loud where I was quiet, charming where I was serious. Our parents used to joke that we were two halves of the same person. I was 5 when Jason taught me to ride a bike, running alongside me in the driveway until I found my balance. He was 7 when I helped him with his first book report, sitting at the kitchen table while I sounded out the harder words. We built forts in the woods behind our house, elaborate structures that Jason designed and I engineered. He had the vision. I made sure it didn't fall down. The pattern established itself early. Jason would get an idea, usually involving some level of mischief or minor rule-breaking, and I would figure out how to make it work without getting us both in trouble. When he decided we should build a tree house in the old oak, I was the one who calculated which branches could hold our weight. When he wanted to sneak out to the county fair, I planned the route and the timeline that would get us back before Mom checked on us. I didn't mind being the practical one. Jason's enthusiasm was infectious, and his schemes usually led to the kind of adventures that made childhood memorable. Plus, Someone had to keep us from getting killed, and it was clear early on that Jason's relationship with consequences was casual at best. He wasn't malicious, just impulsive. When Tommy Richardson started picking on me in 3rd grade, Jason didn't hesitate to intervene, even though Tommy was bigger and older. Jason came home with a black eye and a 3-day suspension, but Tommy never bothered me again. When I cried because I'd forgotten to study for a math test, Jason spent the whole morning before school helping me cram, even though it made him late for his own quiz. But somewhere around middle school, the balance started to shift. Jason's schemes became more elaborate, more risky, and harder to cover for. The treehouse became a place to hide cigarettes stolen from Dad's dresser. The midnight adventures became actual rule-breaking that could get us grounded for weeks. I started saying no more often, and Jason started resenting it. Not openly, he was too smart for that, but in small ways. He'd make jokes about my goody-two-shoes attitude or roll his eyes when I suggested we might get in trouble. He began testing boundaries I hadn't even realized we had. In 8th grade, Jason got caught cheating on a history exam. Not just copying answers, but running an elaborate scheme where he'd photographed the answer key and distributed copies to half the class. When he got suspended, Mom asked me if I'd known what he was doing. I had known. Not the details, but I'd known something was up. I'd seen him acting differently, more secretive, more confident about a subject he'd been struggling with. But I'd chosen not to ask questions because I didn't want to know the answers. He didn't tell me anything, I said, which was technically true. Mom studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, but Lucinda? You can't protect him from everything. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. Protecting Jason wasn't something I chose to do, it was just what siblings did for each other. When he got in trouble, I helped him find solutions. When he made mistakes, I helped him fix them. It seemed natural, even necessary. High school made the dynamic more complicated. Jason played football and dated cheerleaders and seemed to effortlessly navigate the social hierarchies that left me confused. But his grades were terrible, and he had no plan for after graduation. I spent hours helping him with homework, writing papers that were technically his but really mine, making sure he maintained the minimum GPA required to stay on the team. Meanwhile, I was developing my own identity. I joined a debate team, ran for student council, started thinking seriously about college. I wanted to study criminal justice, maybe go into law enforcement. The military seemed like a natural fit, structured, purposeful, a place where discipline and hard work actually meant something. Jason thought it was hilarious. You want to be a cop? Come on, Lucinda. You're not exactly the tough guy type. But I was tougher than he realized. Tougher than I realized, until I got to basic training and discovered what I was actually capable of when someone believed in me. The military gave me something I'd never had before, a place where my natural inclination toward order and planning was seen as a strength rather than a character flaw. Where asking questions and thinking ahead were valued. Where people expected excellence and gave you the tools to achieve it. Jason, meanwhile, drifted. A semester at community college, then a series of jobs that never quite worked out. Construction, sales, briefly working at an auto repair shop until he got fired for showing up late too many times. He moved back in with Mom after each failure, full of explanations about unfair bosses or bad breaks or circumstances beyond his control. I tried to help, the way I always had. I co-signed a lease when his credit was too poor to qualify a loan. I lent him money when his car broke down. I put in a good word with people I knew when he was looking for work. But nothing seemed to stick, and gradually I realized that Jason didn't actually want solutions. He wanted someone to manage the consequences of his choices. The turning point came when he asked me to lie to a potential employer about why he'd been fired from his last job. Not just omit information, but actively create a false story about downsizing and budget cuts. When I refused, he accused me of not caring about family. All I'm asking for is a phone call, he said. 2 minutes of your time to help your brother get back on his feet. I'm not going to lie for you, Jason. Right. Because your precious reputation is more important than helping family. That was the first time he'd made it about my integrity rather than his circumstances. The first time he'd suggested that my refusal to cover for him was a moral failing on my part rather than a natural consequence of his actions. I should have recognized it as a warning sign. Instead, I just felt guilty and confused. Maybe I was being too rigid. Maybe family did mean bending the rules sometimes. Maybe my military training had made me inflexible in ways that hurt the people I cared about. So I made the call. I told the lie. Jason got the job, kept it for 6 months, then got fired again for the same behaviors that had cost him the previous position. When he asked me to make another call, I said no, and the cycle started over. Looking back, I can see how the resentment built. Every time I succeeded, it highlighted his struggles. Every promotion, every commendation, every sign that I was building something meaningful with my life became an implicit criticism of his lack of direction. Not because I intended it that way, but because that's how he chose to interpret it. By the time I got engaged to Emmerich, Jason had stopped pretending to be happy for my successes. He developed a running commentary about my military princess act and my perfect boyfriend, who probably didn't know the real me. The comments were always delivered as jokes, but they carried an edge that grew sharper over time. I told myself it was just sibling rivalry, that he'd grow out of it once he found his own path. But Jason wasn't looking for his own path. He was looking for someone to blame for why he didn't have one, and my success made me the perfect target. The irony was that I'd never stopped loving him or wanting the best for him. Even when I refused to enable his bad choices, it wasn't because I didn't care, it was because I cared too much to watch him destroy himself. But Jason couldn't see the difference between boundaries and abandonment, between consequences and cruelty. So when he shoved me to the floor at my own wedding, it wasn't really about the uniform or the military friends or any of the surface reasons he'd been complaining about. It was about 23 years of accumulated resentment finally finding its target. It was about a man who'd never learned to take responsibility for his own choices, deciding that his problems were someone else's fault. And for the first time in our relationship, I wasn't going to fix it for him. The hospital was quieter than I'd expected. After the chaos of the reception, the blood, the gasps, the awkward silence as the paramedics arrived, the sterile calm of the emergency room felt almost surreal. Emmerich sat beside me while the doctor cleaned the cut and prepared the sutures, his presence steady and reassuring without being overwhelming. 7 stitches, the doctor said, his voice professionally neutral. You were lucky. A few inches to the right and we might be looking at a concussion or worse. Lucky. I touched the bandage gingerly, thinking about how the word sounded in the context of being assaulted by my own brother at my wedding reception. But I understood what he meant. The physical damage could have been much worse. The emotional damage was harder to assess. Emmerich drove me home in silence, both of us still in our formal attire, though his dress blues had a small blood stain on the shoulder where he'd held me after the fall. Neither of us had thought to change before leaving for the hospital. The wedding reception had ended abruptly, guests filing out with concerned murmurs and promises to check in later. Mom had wanted to come to the hospital, but I'd asked her to stay behind and handle the aftermath, the vendors, the cleanup, the inevitable questions from relatives who'd witnessed the whole thing. Someone needed to manage the practical details, and I wasn't ready to deal with the emotional ones. How's your head? Emmerich asked as we pulled into our driveway. Sore. But okay. I paused, looking at our house, officially, as of that morning when we'd signed the papers. I keep replaying it. The moment right before he pushed me. The look in his eyes. Emmerich turned off the engine and faced me. What did you see? Hate. The word came out before I could soften it or find a gentler way to express it. Not anger or frustration or even jealousy. Actual hate. Like he genuinely despised me in that moment. Emmerich nodded slowly. He'd seen it too, I realized. Had probably recognized it before I did, with his training in reading people under stress. He's been building up to this for a while, I continued. All those comments about my uniform, about you, about the military friends. I thought it was just Jason being Jason, you know, running his mouth when he'd been drinking. But it was more than that. People don't usually assault someone over minor irritations. No, they don't. I leaned back against the headrest, suddenly exhausted. I've been making excuses for him my whole life. Telling myself he didn't really mean it, that he was just going through a rough patch, that he'd figure things out eventually. But tonight wasn't about alcohol or stress or anything temporary. That was who he really is when nobody's watching. Inside the house, I changed out of my dress uniform while Emmerich made coffee. The routine felt strange. We should have been on our way to the hotel by now, starting our honeymoon, celebrating the beginning of our life together. Instead, we were processing the fact that my brother had turned our wedding into a crime scene. My phone had been buzzing constantly, texts from friends, relatives, fellow officers who'd witnessed the incident. I'd turned it off at the hospital, but eventually I'd have to deal with the messages. Eventually, I'd have to decide what came next. "The Navy's going to want a statement," Emmerich said, returning with 2 cups of coffee. He'd changed into civilian clothes, but somehow he still looked like an officer, straight posture, alert expression, that particular stillness that comes from years of military training. "I know. And the local police. They'll probably want to file charges." "I know that too." We sat on the couch together, the coffee growing cold while we processed what had happened. In the span of 30 seconds, Jason had transformed from my irresponsible but beloved brother into someone who'd committed assault in front of 50 witnesses. The family dynamics that had governed our relationship for 28 years had been obliterated by one moment of violence. "I always protected him," I said, more to myself than to Emmerich. "When we were kids, when other people criticized him, when he got in trouble, I always found ways to minimize the damage, to give him another chance, to help him bounce back. Even when I knew he was wrong." "That's what family does. Is it? Or is that what enablers do?" I set down my coffee cup and looked at Emmerich. "Be honest with me. From the outside, watching our family dynamic these past few months, did you see this coming?" Emmerich was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I saw someone who was used to being rescued getting frustrated that the rescues were becoming harder to arrange." It was a tactful way of saying what I'd begun to realize myself. Jason hadn't grown out of his dependence on me, he'd grown resentful of it. Instead of appreciating the safety net I provided, he'd started to see it as proof of his own inadequacy. And when my life began to diverge from his in ways that made this safety net less available, he'd responded with increasing hostility. "He used to be different," I said. "When we were kids, he genuinely looked out for me. If someone gave me trouble, Jason would handle it. He was protective, not just self-interested." People change. Sometimes not for the better. Or maybe I just saw what I wanted to see. Maybe he was always this person, and I was just too invested in the idea of who I thought he should be to notice. The hardest part was acknowledging how much energy I'd spent over the years trying to manage Jason's problems instead of building my own life. How many times I'd rearranged my schedule to help him through some crisis. How many opportunities I'd passed up because I was worried about leaving him without support. The military had taught me about accountability, about the importance of facing consequences instead of avoiding them. But I'd never applied those principles to my relationship with Jason. Instead, I'd spent years cushioning his falls, smoothing over his mistakes, providing him with a safety net that allowed him to keep making the same bad choices without experiencing the full weight of their impact. "He's going to try to contact you," Emmerich said quietly. "Probably soon. He's going to want you to fix this, the way you've always fixed things for him." I nodded. I knew Jason well enough to predict his next moves. First would come the phone calls, probably starting tonight once the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. He'd be apologetic, desperate, full of explanations and promises. He'd minimize what had happened, say he was drunk, didn't mean it, lost his temper. He'd remind me of our history, of all the times we'd supported each other, of how family was supposed to stick together. Then, if I didn't respond the way he wanted, would come the guilt trips. He'd accuse me of choosing my career over my family, of letting my military friends turn me against my own brother. He'd find ways to make himself the victim, to paint my refusal to help as yet another example of how I'd changed since joining the service. Finally, if the guilt didn't work, would come the anger. The accusations, the blame, the suggestion that I deserved what happened because of how I'd been acting lately. He'd try to rewrite the narrative, to make the assault seem like a reasonable response to my alleged arrogance and superiority. I'd seen this cycle before in smaller doses. The difference was that this time, I wasn't going to participate in it. "I'm not fixing this," I said, and was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Whatever consequences he's facing, legal, professional, personal, he created them when he decided to assault me at my own wedding. I didn't make him do that. I can't unmake it. And I won't be taking responsibility for cleaning up the aftermath. Emmerich reached over and took my hand. "That's going to be hard. For you and for your family. I know. But it's also necessary." I looked down at our joined hands, his steady and sure, mine still trembling slightly from shock and adrenaline. I spent so many years thinking that taking care of Jason was just what sisters do. But what I was really doing was preventing him from learning how to take care of himself. And maybe, in some twisted way, tonight was the inevitable result of all those years of cushioned consequences. The conversation we'd have to have with our families would be difficult. Mom would want me to smooth things over, to find a way to minimize the damage to Jason's life and career. She'd remind me that he was my brother, that families were supposed to forgive each other, that this could all be worked out quietly if we just handled it the right way. But there was no right way to handle assault. There was no family exception to accountability. And there was no version of this situation where I was responsible for protecting Jason from the consequences of his own violent choices. For the first time in our relationship, he was going to have to face the full weight of what he'd done without me stepping in to soften the impact. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The phone calls started at 6 in the morning. Jason's number flashed on my screen 3 times before I finally turned the phone off entirely. Emmerich was already up, making breakfast with the quiet efficiency he brought to everything, but I could tell from the set of his shoulders that he'd heard the calls too. "How long do you think before he shows up here?" I asked, accepting the cup of coffee he handed me. "Couple hours, maybe. Once he realizes you're not going to answer the phone." We ate in silence, both of us aware that this was just the calm before a much larger storm. By now, word of what had happened at the wedding would be spreading through both our families and my professional network. There would be questions, concerns, offers of support, and probably more than a few suggestions about how we should handle the situation. Mom called at 7:30, using Emmerich's phone when mine went straight to voicemail. "Lucinda, honey, we need to talk about Jason." I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the weight of a sleepless night spent trying to process what her son had done to her daughter. But underneath that, I could also hear something else, the beginnings of an appeal for mercy that I knew was coming. "What about him, Mom?" "He's devastated. Absolutely devastated about what happened. He knows he made a terrible mistake, and he wants to make it right. There's no making this right. He assaulted me at my own wedding." "I know, sweetheart, I know. But he was drinking, and he's been under so much stress lately with work and everything. This isn't who he really is." There it was. The first attempt to minimize what had happened, to find external factors that could explain away Jason's choice to use violence against his own sister. I'd been expecting it, but it still stung to hear it from my mother. "Mom, being drunk doesn't excuse assault. Being stressed doesn't excuse assault. Nothing excuses what he did." "Of course not, but nothing. He made a choice. A choice that left me bleeding on the floor in front of everyone I care about. That choice has consequences, and I'm not going to help him avoid them." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Mom spoke again, her voice was smaller, more fragile. "He could lose his job over this. If the Navy presses charges, if this becomes official, his security clearance could be revoked. His whole career could be over. Then maybe he should have thought about that before he decided to assault a fellow service member." "Lucinda, please. I know you're hurt and angry, and you have every right to be. But he's your brother. We're family. Families find ways to work through these things." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tug of guilt and obligation. This was the conversation I'd been dreading, the one where I'd be asked to sacrifice my own sense of justice for the sake of family harmony. The one where Jason's future would somehow become my responsibility, even though he was the one who'd destroyed it. "Mom, I love you. And despite everything, I still love Jason. But I'm not going to lie to investigators to protect him. I'm not going to refuse to cooperate with any legal proceedings. And I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen for the sake of family appearances." "Nobody's asking you to lie, aren't they?" Because I'm guessing that before this conversation is over, someone's going to suggest that maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked, or maybe I contributed to the situation somehow. Or maybe Jason has suffered enough already and doesn't need any more punishment. Another long silence. I could almost hear her trying to find the words that would change my mind, that would activate whatever family loyalty was supposed to make me put Jason's welfare ahead of my own sense of justice. "He's downstairs," she said finally. "In my kitchen. He's been there all night, crying, saying he doesn't know how this happened. He wants to talk to you, to apologize properly." "I don't want to hear his apology." "Lucinda, I mean it, Mom. An apology doesn't undo what he did. It doesn't take away the stitches in my head or the fact that he turned my wedding into a crime scene. It doesn't change the reality that he looked at me with genuine hatred right before he shoved me to the ground. He was drunk. Drunk people don't usually assault their siblings unless there's something deeper going on. Alcohol doesn't create feelings, it just removes the inhibitions that usually keep us from acting on them." By the time I ended the call, I knew that the family pressure was just beginning. Over the next few days, there would be more phone calls, more visits, more attempts to convince me that protecting Jason was somehow my responsibility. Relatives would remind me of all the times he'd been there for me as a child, all the ways families were supposed to support each other through difficult times. But I'd spent 28 years supporting Jason through difficult times, most of which were the direct result of his own poor choices. I'd covered for him, lied for him, bailed him out, cleaned up his messes, and provided him with a safety net that had prevented him from ever learning to face consequences on his own. And where had that gotten us? To a wedding reception where he felt entitled to assault me because I'd finally built a life that didn't revolve around managing his problems. Emmerich appeared in the doorway, still holding his coffee cup, his expression carefully neutral. "Everything okay? Mom wants me to talk to Jason. She thinks if he apologizes, we can work this out as a family matter instead of involving the authorities. What do you think?" I think Jason lost the right to a family conversation when he decided to get physical. This isn't a disagreement about holiday plans or who said what to whom. This is assault, and it needs to be handled like assault. The doorbell rang before Emmerich could respond. We looked at each other, both knowing who it was likely to be. Jason had apparently decided that showing up in person might be more effective than phone calls. "I'll get it," Emmerich said, but I shook my head. "No. This is my family, my problem. I need to handle it." Jason stood on our front porch looking exactly like I'd expected, disheveled, red-eyed, wearing the same clothes from the night before. He looked smaller than usual, diminished by guilt and panic and the dawning realization that this time, there might not be a way out. "Lucinda." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Please. I need to talk to you." "There's nothing to talk about, Jason. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Just let me explain what happened. Let me apologize properly." I looked at him standing there, my brother who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and promised to always protect me. The same person who'd shoved me to the ground 12 hours earlier with genuine hatred in his eyes. "You want to explain what happened? You got drunk, you got angry that I wasn't paying enough attention to you, and you decided to assault me in front of 50 people. What else is there to explain? It wasn't like that, it was exactly like that. I was there, Jason. I felt your hands on me. I hit the ground. I bled. That's what happened." His face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the scared little boy I remembered from childhood. But I couldn't let that image soften my resolve. That scared little boy had grown into a man who used violence when he didn't get his way. "I was drunk," he said, as if that explained everything. "I wasn't thinking clearly. You know I would never hurt you when I'm sober. Being drunk doesn't excuse what you did. It just means you made the choice to get drunk at my wedding and then made the choice to assault me while you were drunk. 2 choices, Jason. Both yours." I know. But Lucinda, if this goes official, if the Navy gets involved, my whole life is over. My career, my security clearance, everything I've worked for. There it was. Not remorse for hurting me, not genuine understanding of what he'd done wrong, but fear about the consequences he might face. Even now, even after everything, he was still trying to make his problems my responsibility. You should have thought about that before you decided to assault a fellow service member. Don't do this to me. Please. We're family. We've always had each other's backs. I've always had your back, I corrected. When's the last time you had mine? When's the last time you supported me without making it about yourself somehow? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. We both knew he couldn't think of an example. This is different, he said finally. This is my whole future we're talking about. It was your whole future when you made the choice to shove me to the ground. You gambled it, and you lost. I'm not responsible for cleaning up the consequences. I could see the desperation building in his expression, the panic of someone who'd always been rescued before and couldn't quite believe that this time might be different. But underneath that, I could also see the same resentment that had been building for months. He wasn't just scared, he was angry that I wasn't automatically fixing this for him. Fine, he said, his voice hardening. Be the perfect soldier. Choose your precious career over your own brother. Just remember, when all your military friends move on to their next assignment, when Emmerich decides you're too much work, family is what you'll have left. And you'll have thrown it away over one stupid mistake. This wasn't a mistake, Jason. Mistakes are accidental. You chose to assault me because you were angry and drunk and thought you could get away with it. I never meant for you to get hurt. You shoved me hard enough to knock me down. What did you think was going to happen? He had no answer for that, because we both knew he hadn't been thinking about my welfare when he put his hands on me. He'd been thinking about his own anger, his own resentment, his own need to lash out at someone who represented everything he felt he'd failed to become. I can't undo what happened, he said finally. But I can promise it will never happen again. Isn't that worth something? Promises don't mean much when they come after consequences start kicking in. Where was this promise yesterday? Where was it last week when you were making snide comments about my uniform? Where was it last month when you were questioning Emmerich's service record? Jason's face flushed red, anger finally overwhelming desperation. So this is revenge? You're going to destroy my life because I said some things you didn't like. I'm not destroying anything, Jason. You destroyed your own life when you decided to assault me. I'm just not going to lie to protect you from the consequences. Right. Because you're so much better than me now. The perfect officer who never makes mistakes, never needs help from anybody. And there it was, the real Jason, the one who'd been hiding under all the apologies and explanations. Still angry, still resentful, still convinced that his problems were somehow my fault. I've made plenty of mistakes, I said quietly. The biggest one was spending 28 years enabling you instead of letting you learn to face consequences on your own. Maybe if I'd stopped covering for you sooner, you would have learned to control your temper before it got to this point. I closed the door on his protests and locked it behind me. Through the window, I watched him stand there for another minute, probably hoping I'd change my mind and come back out. When I didn't, he walked slowly back to his car, shoulders slumped in defeat. It was the first time in our entire relationship that I'd refused to rescue him. And despite everything, despite the anger and hurt and disappointment, it felt like the right thing to do. 2 weeks later, the changes in my life were unmistakable. The formal investigation had begun, my statement was on record, and Jason's security clearance was under review. The family drama had settled into a pattern of cold silence, punctuated by occasional attempts at mediation from well-meaning relatives. But professionally, something unexpected was happening. Instead of the whispered conversations and awkward sympathy I'd been dreading, I found myself receiving a different kind of attention from my fellow officers. Respect, not pity. Recognition, not concern. Commander Phillips called me into his office 3 days after the wedding. How are you holding up, Lieutenant? Fine, sir. Ready to get back to work. He studied my face for a moment, probably looking for signs of emotional distress or instability. Finding none, he nodded slightly. I've reviewed your statement about the incident. I want you to know that the Navy takes assault against its personnel very seriously, regardless of who the perpetrator might be. I understand, sir. Do you? Because I've seen situations like this before, where family pressure causes the victim to minimize what happened or refuse to cooperate with the investigation. I met his eyes directly. That won't be happening here, sir. Good. Because the way you've handled this situation, the composure under pressure, the commitment to accountability, the refusal to let personal relationships compromise professional obligations, that's exactly the kind of integrity we need in our officer corps. It wasn't the conversation I'd expected. I'd been prepared for awkward questions about my family stability or my ability to separate personal issues from professional duties. Instead, I was being commended for the very thing Jason had accused me of, choosing principle over family loyalty. The same pattern repeated itself over the following days. Senior officers who'd never paid much attention to me before began including me in strategic conversations. My opinions carried more weight in staff meetings. When a special assignment came up, one that required someone with proven judgment under pressure, my name was at the top of the list. It took me a while to understand what was happening. In military culture, how you handle crisis reveals character. The fact that I'd maintained discipline and integrity even when it meant holding my own brother accountable for assault had marked me as someone who could be trusted with greater responsibilities. Jason, meanwhile, was discovering what life looked like without his usual safety net. His security clearance was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. His supervisor, made aware of the situation through official channels, had placed him on administrative leave. The career he'd been so terrified of losing was slipping away exactly as he'd feared. Mom called regularly with updates I hadn't asked for. Jason was seeing a therapist. Jason was going to AA meetings. Jason was really working on himself and hoped I could see that he was serious about changing. But I'd heard variations of this story before, usually after Jason had faced consequences for previous bad choices. The promises, the temporary improvements, the eventual return to old patterns once the immediate crisis passed. The difference was that this time, I wasn't invested in the outcome. "He's your brother," Mom said during one of these calls. "Doesn't that mean anything to you anymore?" "It means I hope he gets the help he needs and learns to make better choices. But it doesn't mean I'm responsible for managing the consequences of his bad ones." When did you become so cold? The question stung, partly because I'd been asking myself the same thing. Had the military changed me in ways that made me less compassionate? Had I become too rigid, too focused on rules and consequences? But then I remembered the look in Jason's eyes right before he shoved me. The hatred, the entitlement, the calculation. That hadn't been a moment of temporary insanity brought on by alcohol and stress. That had been the real Jason, finally revealed when his usual manipulations failed to work. "I'm not cold, Mom. I'm just done pretending that enabling someone's destructive behavior is the same thing as loving them." Emmerich found me on the balcony that evening, staring out at the harbor where ships moved in slow, purposeful patterns. He'd been giving me space to process everything, but I could tell he had things to say. Rough phone call. "Mom thinks I've become heartless because I won't help Jason avoid consequences for assaulting me. What do you think?" I considered the question seriously. 2 months ago, I would have been looking for ways to minimize the damage to Jason's life, to find some compromise that satisfied the military's need for accountability while protecting my brother from the worst outcomes. The old Lucinda would have been making phone calls, pulling strings, trying to manage the situation for everyone's benefit. "I think I've finally learned the difference between helping someone and enabling them," I said. Jason spent 28 years believing that someone else would always clean up his messes. That's not love, that's dysfunction. And it obviously didn't help him become a better person. No, it didn't. The strangest part is how much respect I'm getting at work for doing exactly what Jason accused me of, choosing my principles over family loyalty. Turns out that integrity actually matters to people in ways I never fully understood. Emmerich nodded. "In the teams, we have a saying, you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You can only choose whether to go down with them." That night, I found myself looking through old photo albums, trying to pinpoint when things had started to go wrong between Jason and me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe things had never been right. I'd just been too invested in the idea of being a good sister to notice. The Jason who'd protected me from bullies as a child was the same Jason who'd grown resentful when I succeeded as an adult. The Jason who'd helped me with homework was the same Jason who'd cheated on his own exams. The patterns had always been there. I'd just chosen to focus on the positive ones while making excuses for the negative ones. But the military had taught me that character isn't revealed by your best moments. It's revealed by how you behave when you think no one important is watching, when you're under pressure, when doing the right thing costs you something. Jason's character had been revealed when he thought he could assault me without consequences. My character was being revealed by how I chose to respond. For the first time since the wedding, I felt genuinely at peace with my decision. 3 months after the wedding, Jason's case was resolved. Guilty plea, dishonorable discharge, 1 year of probation, mandatory anger management, and substance abuse counseling. His security clearance was permanently revoked, effectively ending any chance of working in his field again. The family had hoped I might attend his hearing, maybe even speak on his behalf about his character and potential for rehabilitation. I declined. Not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't believe Jason was ready to take full responsibility for what he'd done. His plea statement had been filled with references to alcohol and stress and family dynamics, everything except a clear acknowledgement that he'd chosen to assault me because he was angry. He's lost everything, Mom said when she called to update me on the outcome. His job, his career, his future. Are you satisfied now? This isn't about my satisfaction, Mom. It's about accountability. Jason made choices, and now he's living with the consequences of those choices. He was drinking, Mom. We've had this conversation. Being drunk doesn't excuse assault. Having family problems doesn't excuse assault. Nothing excuses what he did, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make anyone feel better. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the concept of consequences. For 28 years, I'd helped Jason avoid them. Every time he'd made a bad choice, I'd been there to cushion the fall, to provide alternatives, to help him find ways around the natural results of his actions. I'd told myself I was being a good sister, that supporting family meant helping them through difficult times. But what I'd actually been doing was preventing Jason from learning one of the most basic lessons of adulthood, that actions have consequences, and those consequences are how we learn to make better choices. By constantly rescuing him, I'd accidentally taught him that he could make bad choices without facing bad outcomes, as long as someone else was willing to pay the price. I'd created a moral hazard that had ultimately led to a situation where he felt entitled to assault me when I finally stopped providing those rescues. The irony was that if I'd been less helpful over the years, if I'd let him face natural consequences earlier in his life, he might have learned self-control and accountability when the stakes were lower. Instead, my attempts to protect him had actually put him in a position where he was destined to face much more severe consequences later. Emmerich found me still sitting at the kitchen table an hour later, lost in thought. Everything okay? Jason's case is resolved. Dishonorable discharge, probation, counseling. Emmerich poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. How do you feel about that? Honestly? Sad. Not because he's facing consequences, but because it took consequences this severe for him to start addressing his problems. If he'd been willing to take responsibility for his actions 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or even 6 months ago, none of this would have been necessary. Some people only learn the hard way. And some people never learn at all. I looked up at Emmerich. Do you think I did the right thing? I think you did the only thing that had any chance of actually helping him in the long run. Enabling someone's destructive behavior isn't kindness, it's just delayed cruelty. That evening, I found myself thinking about the wedding photos we'd eventually received from the photographer. She'd edited out the blood, the chaos, the aftermath of Jason's assault. In the formal portraits, Emmerich and I looked happy and confident, surrounded by family and friends, beginning our life together. But if you looked closely at the candid shots from earlier in the reception, you could see the tension building. Jason in the background, drink in hand, watching me with an expression that should have been a warning. Me, focused on my guests and my new husband, oblivious to the storm gathering at the edge of the frame. Those photos told the real story, not the fairy tale version where everything worked out perfectly, but the complicated truth about families and consequences and the price of enabling dysfunction for the sake of peace. I kept one of those candid shots. The one where you can see Jason watching me with barely contained resentment. Not because I wanted to remember the bad parts of our relationship, but because I wanted to remember the lesson that ignoring problems doesn't make them go away, it just allows them to grow larger and more dangerous. The scar on my head had faded to a thin line, barely visible under my hair. But the internal changes were more profound. I'd learned to distinguish between love and enabling, between family loyalty and personal responsibility. I discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to protect them from the consequences of their choices. Jason had tried to humiliate me in front of everyone. Instead, he'd revealed who he really was. And for the first time, I didn't cover it up. 6 months later, life had settled into new patterns. Emmerich and I were both thriving professionally. His team had been selected for a high-profile training assignment, and I'd been promoted to a position that came with significantly more responsibility and visibility. Our marriage felt solid, strengthened by the way we'd handled crisis together. Jason had moved to another state, ostensibly for a fresh start, but probably also to escape the local consequences of his actions. He'd found work in construction, far removed from anything requiring security clearance or background checks. According to Mom, he was still in counseling and had been sober for 4 months. I hoped that was true. Despite everything, I still wanted him to succeed, to learn from what had happened, to become the kind of person who could build healthy relationships. But I wasn't invested in the outcome the way I used to be. His recovery was his responsibility, not mine. The family dynamics had shifted permanently. Some relatives had chosen sides, mostly mine, once they'd had time to process what had actually happened at the wedding. Others maintained relationships with both of us, but carefully avoided mentioning one to the other. A few still believed I'd been too harsh, that family should forgive family regardless of circumstances. Mom had been the hardest to navigate. She loved both of us and couldn't understand why we couldn't find a way back to each other. But gradually, she'd begun to accept that some bridges, once burned, don't get rebuilt. He asks about you, she said during one of our increasingly infrequent conversations. Wonders how you're doing, whether you ever think about him. I hope he's doing well, I said, which was true as far as it went. Maybe someday, Mom. I interrupted gently but firmly. Jason assaulted me at my own wedding. He looked at me with hatred and deliberately hurt me because he was angry that I'd built a life that didn't revolve around managing his problems. That's not something that gets fixed with time or therapy or good intentions. People change, some people do. But change has to come from within, and it has to be sustained over years, not months. Even if Jason becomes a completely different person, that doesn't erase what he did or create an obligation for me to have a relationship with him. It wasn't a conversation she wanted to have, but it was one we needed to have. The fantasy of eventual family reconciliation was preventing her from accepting the reality of what had happened and moving forward in her own healing process. At work, the respect I'd gained from handling the situation with integrity had continued to compound. I'd been selected for leadership training, included in strategic planning meetings, and given assignments that were typically reserved for more senior officers. My reputation as someone who could be trusted to do the right thing even under personal pressure had opened doors I hadn't even known existed. Commander Phillips called me in for my annual review, which had become more of a career planning session than a performance evaluation. You've had quite a year, Lieutenant. Yes, sir. How are you processing everything that's happened? I considered the question carefully. I think I've learned some important lessons about boundaries, sir. About the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. About the importance of accountability, even when it's difficult or painful. Those are hard lessons to learn. Yes, sir. But necessary ones. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same expression I'd seen him use when evaluating complex tactical problems. I'm going to be direct with you, Lieutenant. The way you handled your family situation, the integrity, the composure, the commitment to principle over convenience, that's exactly what we need in our senior leadership. You've demonstrated character under pressure, and that's worth more than any technical skill or academic achievement. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering career paths and educational opportunities and assignments that would prepare me for increased responsibility. It was the kind of discussion I dreamed about when I first joined the service, but it felt strange to realize that my greatest professional opportunity had emerged from my most painful personal crisis. That evening, Emmerich and I walked along the waterfront, talking about the future in ways we hadn't been able to 6 months earlier. Then, we'd been focused on surviving the immediate aftermath of trauma. Now, we could think about building something positive from the lessons we'd learned. Do you ever regret it? He asked. The way you handled things with Jason? Sometimes I regret that it was necessary. I regret that he made choices that led to this outcome. But I don't regret refusing to enable those choices or protect him from their consequences. Even knowing what it cost? Especially knowing what it cost. Because the alternative, continuing to cover for him, to make excuses, to provide a safety net for his bad decisions, would have cost more in the long run. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ships navigate the harbor with their lights reflecting on the dark water. There was something peaceful about the purposeful movement, the careful adherence to established channels and protocols that kept everyone safe. He tried to humiliate me in front of everyone, I said finally. Instead, he revealed who he really was. And for the first time, I didn't cover it up. Emmerich nodded. That took courage. It took clarity. Once I stopped seeing Jason as the brother I wanted him to be and started seeing him as the person he actually was, the choice became obvious. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and you shouldn't destroy yourself trying. The scar on my head was barely visible now, but I touched it occasionally, not from self-consciousness, but as a reminder. A reminder that actions have consequences, that family doesn't excuse assault, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive choices. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the calm strength of refusing to bend, of maintaining your principles even when it costs you relationships, of choosing accountability over convenience. It's in the quiet decision to let people face the consequences of their actions instead of rushing in to fix things for them. Jason had gambled everything on one moment of violence, convinced that I would cover for him the way I always had. He'd lost that bet, and in losing it, he'd revealed not just his own character, but mine as well. I was done being the sister who cleaned up messes. I was ready to be the officer who held people accountable for their choices, starting with the people closest to me. It was a harder path, but it was the right one. And for the first time in 28 years, I wasn't looking backward to fix someone else's mistakes. I was looking forward to building something better. That night taught me something simple but hard, that family doesn't excuse assault, and enabling someone isn't the same as loving them. I chose boundaries, and for the first time, I didn't cover for my brother. Have you ever had to cut off someone you kept protecting for too long? Did it feel like strength or guilt? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe accountability matters, even with family, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about standing your ground.